The man who destroyed my life was teaching my son robotics every Tuesday for 6 months. And he had no idea the 12-year-old boy calling him Mr. Walker was his own child. I'd kept that secret for 15 years through welfare lines and double shifts and nights. I cried myself to sleep because he looked me in the eye when I was pregnant and said he couldn't do it. Now here he sat in room 12B, a billionaire in a $1,000 suit, smiling at our son like he'd earned the right. I stood in that doorway, and the only thought screaming through my head was, does he get to have this? Betty Smith was already 10 minutes late when she pulled into Riverside Elementary's parking lot, her server apron still tied around her waist and the smell of French fries clinging to her hair. The dinner shift at Maurice's diner had run long, a bachelor party that ordered everything twice and tipped like they were doing her a favor. She'd texted Mrs. Mendoza an apology, grabbed Charles's homework folder from the passenger seat, and practically ran through the hallway in her non-slip shoes that squeaked against linoleum with every step. Room 12B sat at the end of the 4th grade wing. Door half open, warm light spilling into the darkened corridor. She could hear voices inside Mrs. Mendoza's patient, teacher tone, and a deeper voice, masculine, unfamiliar. Probably another parent who'd arrived early, she figured, smoothing down her uniform and wishing she'd had time to change. Betty pushed the door open with her shoulder, already forming an apology. Sorry I'm late, Mrs. Mendoza. The dinner rush was, the words died in her throat. Because sitting in the chair beside her son, her beautiful, brilliant, 12-year-old son who'd never met his father, was Ralph Walker. The Ralph Walker. Her Ralph Walker. The man she hadn't seen in 15 years. The man whose face she'd trained herself not to Google, whose Forbes covers she avoided at grocery store checkouts, whose name she'd taught herself to hear without flinching. The man who'd held her face in his hands and whispered promises about forever before choosing his company over their child. Time collapsed. The classroom disappeared. Betty was 23 again, standing in their tiny apartment with a positive pregnancy test in her shaking hands, watching the man she loved look at her like she'd just asked him to jump off a bridge. Betty. His voice hit her like a physical thing, lower now, aged by years and boardroom negotiations, but still carrying that particular cadence that used to make her heart skip, still capable of undoing her with a single word. She couldn't speak, couldn't move. The homework folder slipped from her fingers and hit the floor with a soft thud that seemed impossibly loud in the sudden silence. Mrs. Mendoza stood near her desk, confusion flickering across her face as she glanced between them. Charles oblivious. Beautiful Charles with his father's eyes and her stubborn chin popped up from his seat with the boundless energy of a kid who didn't understand he was standing at ground zero of his mother's earthquake. Mom, you're here. He grabbed her hand, tugging her forward. This is so cool. Mr. Walker is my mentor from the STEM program. You know, the one I told you about? The one who's been helping with my robotics project? Betty's heart stopped. Mentor. Her ex-boyfriend, her son's father, had been mentoring Charles for months, spending Tuesday afternoons in the school library teaching him about circuits and coding and engineering principles, encouraging dreams that Betty had nurtured alone through endless homework sessions at their kitchen table, building a relationship with his own son without knowing it. Without her knowing it, she forced her eyes from Ralph's face to Charles's eager expression, scrambling for words that wouldn't shatter the innocence in his smile. That's wonderful, sweetheart. Her voice came out strangled, barely recognizable. Ralph stood slowly, and Betty registered details against her will: the tailored suit that probably cost more than her monthly rent, the silver threading through his dark hair, the way success sat on his shoulders like he'd been born to wear it. But underneath all that polish was something raw, something that looked like recognition and shock and a dawning, terrible understanding. His gaze moved from her face to Charles, then back again. She watched him do the math: Charles's age, the timeline, the unmistakable features they shared. Watched color drain from his face as the truth assembled itself like pieces of a puzzle he'd been too blind to see. Mrs. Smith, Mrs. Mendoza said carefully, clearly sensing the tension crackling through the room like static electricity. I wasn't expecting both of you at the same time. The sign-up sheet must have. I didn't know. Ralph's voice cut through the teacher's diplomatic rescue attempt. He was still staring at Charles. Betty, I didn't when I signed up for the mentorship program. They just gave me names and schedules. I never saw parent information. I never. Don't. The word came out sharper than Betty intended. She was shaking now, adrenaline and 15 years of suppressed grief flooding her system all at once. Not here. Not now. Charles looked between them, confusion replacing excitement. You two know each other? The question hung in the air like smoke. Betty felt Mrs. Mendoza's concerned gaze, felt Ralph's desperate need for answers, felt her son's innocent confusion threatening to crack open secrets she'd protected for over a decade. Ralph spoke before she could. Charles, your mother and I. He paused, choosing words with visible effort. We have a history. The phrase was so inadequate it would have been funny if Betty's heart wasn't trying to beat its way out of her chest. A history, like they were old classmates, like they hadn't created a life together, like he hadn't looked her in the eye and said, I can't do this, before walking out of her apartment and straight into the future he'd chosen instead. Like old friends? Charles asked, glancing at his mother for confirmation. Betty swallowed against the razor blades in her throat. Something like that. Sweetheart. She watched pain flicker across Ralph's face at the word something, watched him absorb the dismissal like a blow. Good. Let him hurt. Let him feel a fraction of what she'd felt filling out birth certificate paperwork with Father Unknown written in neat script. Let him taste the loneliness of 2 a.m. feedings and emergency room visits and first steps that no one else witnessed. Mrs. Mendoza cleared her throat. Well, perhaps we should reschedule? Given the circumstances? Yes. Betty grabbed Charles's backpack from beside his chair, needing to move, needing to escape before the walls closed in completely. We'll reschedule. Thank you, Mrs. Mendoza. She took Charles's hand and turned toward the door, but Ralph's voice stopped her. Betty, please, we need to talk. She didn't turn around, didn't trust herself to look at him again without either screaming or crying, or both. There's nothing to talk about, Ralph. You made your choice 15 years ago. I didn't know. And whose fault is that? The question silenced him. Betty felt Charles's hand squeeze, hers confused, worried, sensing his mother's distress even if he didn't understand its source. She pulled him gently toward the hallway, moving on legs that felt like they might give out any second. Behind them, she heard Mrs. Mendoza say something soft and diplomatic to Ralph. Heard his response words she couldn't make out, but whose tone carried devastation. Betty didn't let herself cry until they reached the parking lot. Didn't let herself collapse until Charles was buckled in and asking careful questions she wasn't ready to answer. Didn't let herself admit that seeing Ralph Walker after 15 years felt exactly like falling, terrifying and inevitable, and completely beyond her control. She started the car with shaking hands, pulling out of the parking lot just as Ralph emerged from the building, his face illuminated by the streetlight. He stood there, watching them drive away, looking lost in a way that billionaire CEOs weren't supposed to look. Looking like a man who just discovered everything he thought he knew about his life was wrong. CTA has shown. If you've ever had your past show up uninvited in the last place you expected, if you know what it's like to protect a secret so long you forgot it was crushing you, you're not walking this road alone. Subscribe to this channel because we're building a community of women who understand that some stories don't have easy answers, only honest ones. And you deserve to hear them all. Betty made it exactly 3 blocks before she had to pull over. Her hands were shaking so badly she couldn't grip the steering wheel. Her vision blurred with tears she'd been holding back since the moment she'd seen his face. She pulled into the parking lot of a closed hardware store, threw the car into park, and pressed her forehead against the steering wheel while her body tried to remember how to breathe. Mom? Charles's voice was small, worried. Are you okay? She wanted to lie. Wanted to paste on the smile she'd perfected over 15 years of doing everything alone, the smile that said, we're fine, baby, we're always fine. But her face wouldn't cooperate. Her throat wouldn't open. I just need a minute. Sweetheart, she managed. In the rearview mirror, she saw headlights pull in behind them. Expensive headlights. The kind that came standard on cars that cost more than her annual salary. No. No, no, no. Ralph's Mercedes slid into the space beside them. Through her passenger window, she watched him kill the engine and step out, still wearing that $1,000 suit, still looking like he'd walked off the cover of a business magazine, still looking like the man who'd promised her forever and delivered abandonment instead. He approached her window carefully, like she was a wounded animal that might bolt. She was. Betty cracked the window an inch. Go away, Ralph. Betty, please, just 5 minutes. You don't get to ask me for anything. I know, his voice cracked. I know, I don't. But Charles, don't you dare say his name. She whipped around to face him fully now. All the careful control she'd maintained in the classroom, shattering like glass. You don't get to say his name. You don't get to stand there in your designer suit and act like you have any right to be part of this. Charles was silent in the back seat, watching with wide eyes that looked too much like his father's. Ralph ran a hand through his hair, a gesture she remembered from late nights when problems felt insurmountable. Can we please talk somewhere private? No, whatever you have to say, you can say right here. He glanced at Charles, hesitated, then seemed to make a decision. I didn't know. I swear to you, Betty, I had no idea he was mine. The word mine sent rage spiraling through her chest. He's not yours. He stopped being yours the moment you walked out. I didn't walk out on him. I didn't know he existed. You walked out on me. The words exploded from somewhere deep and primal. The place where she'd buried 15 years of grief and fury and exhaustion. You looked at me and said you couldn't do it. You chose your company, your future, your freedom over us. So don't you dare stand there acting like you're the victim in this story. Ralph flinched like she'd struck him. I was terrified. So was I. I was 23 years old, working 2 jobs, and pregnant with a baby whose father told me he couldn't do this. You know what I did with my terror, Ralph? I became a mother anyway. I figured it out. I showed up. Her voice was rising now, all the careful composure she'd maintained for Charles's sake, dissolving in the face of 15 years of anger. I held him when he was sick. I taught him to read. I worked double shifts so he could have birthday parties and school supplies and shoes that actually fit. I became mother and father both while you were busy building your empire. Betty, no. She cut him off, tears streaming down her face now. You don't get to waltz back in and play the remorseful father. You forfeited that right. You don't know what it's like to explain to your son why he doesn't have a daddy. You don't know what it's like to watch other kids at school with their fathers and see that question in his eyes, the one he's too kind to ask but is always there. What's wrong with me that my father didn't want me? Ralph's face went pale. Betty, I never. That's the point, Ralph. You never showed up. You never called. You never fought for us. And now you want to act like this is some tragic misunderstanding? Like if you'd only known, everything would have been different. She wiped her eyes roughly, not caring that her mascara was probably running, not caring that Charles was witnessing this unraveling. Maybe he needed to see it. Maybe he needed to understand that his mother had fought for him when no one else would. Ralph's hands were shaking. She could see it even through the window, the tremor that ran through his fingers as he gripped the car door frame. I was drowning, he said quietly. That year, the year we were together, I was barely keeping my head above water. The company was hemorrhaging money. Investors were pulling out. I was working 100-hour weeks, trying to save something that kept slipping through my fingers. And that's supposed to make it okay? No. God, no. But you asked why I ran, and I'm trying to tell you. He closed his eyes, and for the first time, she saw genuine anguish on his face. The night you told me you were pregnant, I was 3 days away from losing everything. The bank had called in our loans. My co-founder had just quit. I was sleeping in the office because I couldn't afford rent on my apartment anymore. Betty's jaw tightened. She didn't want to hear this. Didn't want the explanation she'd needed 15 years ago showing up now when it was too late to matter. But Ralph kept talking, words spilling out like he'd been holding them in for over a decade. When you told me, all I could think about was my father. His voice dropped to barely a whisper. He left when I was 7. Walked out on my mom and me because he couldn't handle the pressure. That's what my mom told me, that he loved us. But the responsibility was too much, and he broke under the weight of it. He opened his eyes, and Betty saw tears there for the first time since she'd known him. I convinced myself I was being noble, that if I couldn't give you and the baby everything, stability, security, the life you deserved, then it was better to step away, that I was breaking the cycle by not becoming my father. He laughed bitterly. But I became him anyway. I became exactly what I feared most. Betty's throat ached with the weight of words she couldn't speak. Part of her, the part that had loved him, once wanted to reach through the window and touch his face. Wanted to tell him she understood. Wanted to bridge the 15-year gap with forgiveness. But the mother in her, the part that had survived because she had to, that had built a life from nothing because there was no other choice, that part stayed rigid. Charles needs stability, she said, her voice cold now, hardened. He needs routine and safety, and people who show up. He doesn't need ghosts from my past, disrupting everything we've built. I want to show up now, Ralph said desperately. Please, Betty. Let me try. She looked at him, really looked at him, and saw the boy she'd fallen in love with, buried somewhere beneath the success and the suit and the years. Saw the vulnerability he'd always hidden behind ambition. Saw the regret etched into lines that hadn't been there when they were young and stupid, and thought love was enough. But she also saw 15 years of missed moments. 15 years of Charles asking why other kids had dads, and he didn't. 15 years of doing it alone, because this man had decided his fear mattered more than their future. Go home, Ralph, she said quietly. You made your choice. Now live with it. She rolled up the window before he could respond, started the engine, and pulled out of the parking lot without looking back. In the rearview mirror, she watched Ralph stand alone under the streetlight, his shoulders hunched, his head bowed. He looked smaller somehow. Less like the billionaire CEO who commanded boardrooms, and more like the terrified boy who'd run from responsibility 15 years ago. She almost stopped. Almost. CTA #2. Some of you know exactly what Betty just did. You know what it feels like to drive away from someone who finally wants to try 15 years too late. You know the weight of protecting a child from disappointment, even when part of you wants to believe in second chances. If that's you, hit that like button. Let me know you're here. Let me know these stories matter to you too, because they do, and so do you. Ralph stood in that parking lot long after Betty's taillights disappeared, the November wind cutting through his suit jacket like it was nothing. He'd negotiated billion-dollar deals without breaking a sweat. He'd faced hostile board members and survived corporate takedowns, but nothing had ever knocked him down the way Betty's words just had. You forfeited that right. He drove home on autopilot, his penthouse apartment looming like a monument to everything he'd chosen instead of her. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city. Original art on the walls. Silence so complete it echoed. He'd built this. Built all of it. And for what? Ralph poured himself a scotch he didn't drink, and stood at the window staring at lights that blurred together like stars. He tried to remember the last time he'd felt something this raw. The last time anything had mattered enough to crack through the armor he'd spent 15 years constructing. He kept seeing Charles's face, kept cataloging the features they shared, the same stubborn jaw, the same way his eyebrows pulled together when he concentrated, the same quick smile that lit up a room. His son. He had a son. Ralph walked to his home office and pulled up the STEM program files on his laptop. It took him a moment to find the folder photos from the mentorship sessions. He clicked through them slowly, seeing Charles with new eyes now. One photo stopped him cold. Charles holding up a completed circuit board, grinning with pride. In the background, slightly blurred, Ralph's own hand rested on the boy's shoulder, a gesture of encouragement he'd offered dozens of times without knowing the truth. He'd been touching his son, guiding him, teaching him, building a relationship that should have started 12 years earlier in a hospital room, should have included first steps and first words, and bedtime stories. Ralph downloaded the photo and stared at it until his vision blurred. What's wrong with me that my father didn't want me? Betty's words circled like vultures. Had Charles asked that question? Had his son spent 12 years thinking he wasn't wanted? The scotch glass shattered against the marble floor. Ralph didn't move to clean it up. He just sat there in his empty penthouse, staring at the photo of a boy he'd mentored without knowing he was mentoring his own child, and let himself feel the full weight of everything he'd lost. Betty burned the spaghetti. She never burned dinner. In 15 years of single motherhood, through double shifts and exhaustion that felt like drowning, she'd maintained this one constant: a hot meal on the table every night at 6:30. It was pride. It was routine. It was proof that they were okay, that Charles had everything he needed, even if his father had never wanted to provide it. But tonight, she stood at the stove stirring sauce that had gone from simmering to scalded while her mind replayed the parking lot confrontation on an endless loop. The smoke detector went off before she even smelled the burning. Charles rushed in from the living room where he'd been pretending to do homework, waving a dish towel at the ceiling while she dumped the ruined pot into the sink. It's fine, she said automatically, though her voice shook. I'll make something else. Mom, Charles's hand touched her elbow gently. We can just order pizza. She looked at him, really looked at him for the first time since they'd left the school. At 12, he was already showing signs of the man he'd become. Thoughtful, observant, too kind for his own good. And those eyes, God, those eyes that she'd convinced herself came from her side of the family until tonight, when she'd seen them reflected in Ralph's face, and could no longer pretend. Pizza sounds good, she managed. They ate on the couch with paper plates, and a movie neither of them watched. Betty could feel Charles glancing at her, between bites, questions building behind his careful silence. He'd inherited her ability to read tension the way some people read books, cataloging every tight smile, every distant stare, every moment his mother's hands trembled around her slice. When the movie ended, and she'd cleaned up the plates with movements that felt mechanical, Betty retreated to her bedroom. She needed space, needed to breathe, needed to figure out how to rebuild the walls that seeing Ralph had demolished. She'd barely closed the door when she heard the soft knock. Mom, can we talk? Betty's heart seized. She knew that tone. That was Charles's serious voice, the one he used when asking about bills he shouldn't have seen, or why they couldn't afford the field trip everyone else was going on, or whether she was okay when she thought he wasn't watching her cry in the bathroom at 2 a.m. She opened the door to find him standing in the hallway in his pajamas, arms wrapped around himself like he was cold even though the apartment was warm. Of course, baby. Come in. He sat on the edge of her bed, the spot he'd claimed for nighttime conversations, since he was small enough to need her to check for monsters under the bed. Betty sat beside him, her whole body bracing for impact. Charles was quiet for a long moment, studying his hands. When he finally spoke, his voice was careful, measured like he was diffusing a bomb and knew one wrong word could make it explode. Mom, is Mr. Walker my dad? The question hung in the air like smoke. Betty felt something crack inside her chest, not a clean break, but a splintering, the kind that spreads in 1,000 directions and leaves nothing intact. Why would you ask that? She heard herself stalling, buying seconds she didn't have. Because of how you looked at each other. Charles turned to face her, and she saw tears gathering in his eyes. Like you knew him, like he hurt you. And then in the car when you were talking to him, you said he walked out, and he kept saying he didn't know. He paused, voice dropping to a whisper. Didn't know about me. Betty's throat closed. She'd underestimated him. Had thought 12 was still young enough to miss the subtext. To not piece together the fragments of adult pain into a coherent picture. But Charles had always been observant. Had always seen more than she wanted him to see. She reached for his hand, gripping it like a lifeline. Yes, Ralph Walker is your father. The words felt strange in her mouth, acknowledging out loud what she'd hidden for over a decade. Charles didn't cry, didn't rage. He just nodded slowly, processing his jaw, working the way it did when he was trying to hold emotion back. Did he know about me? His voice cracked on the question. Before today. No, sweetheart. He didn't. Because you didn't tell him? Betty felt the accusation even though he hadn't meant it as one. Because he left before I could. He was starting his company and things were difficult, and when I told him I was pregnant, she swallowed hard. He said he couldn't do it, so I made the choice to raise you alone. Why didn't you tell him later? After he was successful? It was a fair question. One she'd asked herself late at night when Charles was small and money was so tight she had to choose between electricity and groceries. When she saw Ralph's face on magazine covers and wondered if one email could change their lives. Because I was angry, she said honestly, and hurt, and terrified that if I told him, he'd either ignore us or try to take you away. I thought I was protecting you. Charles was quiet, absorbing this. Then he asked the question that nearly undid her. Does he want to know me now? Betty's breath hitched. She thought of Ralph standing in that parking lot, devastation written across his face. Thought of the way he'd looked at Charles in the classroom, recognition dawning like a sunrise. Thought of his desperate plea. Let me try. I think he does, she whispered. But Charles, I need you to understand something. He gave up that right a long time ago. He doesn't get to just show up and be your father because it's convenient now. What if I want him to? The question hit like a physical blow. Betty turned to look at her son, her beautiful, brilliant boy, who'd never asked for any of this, and saw hope flickering in his eyes. The same hope she'd seen in Ralph's face. The same hope she'd been crushing for 15 years. Sweetheart, I'm not saying I forgive him or anything, Charles said quickly. I don't even really understand what happened, but he's been my mentor for months, Mom. He taught me about circuits and coding and robotics. He's been showing up, his voice cracked. What if he keeps showing up? Betty pulled him into her arms, holding him the way she had when he was small, and the world was simple, and she could fix every hurt with a kiss and a band-aid. But this wasn't something she could fix. This was a wound that had been bleeding for 12 years, and she just pulled off the bandage. I don't know what happens next, she admitted against his hair. I don't know if we can trust him. I don't know if he'll stay or if he'll run again. All I know is that I love you more than anything in this world, and I will protect you no matter what. Charles nodded against her shoulder. They sat like that for a long time, mother and son, holding each other in the wreckage of a secret finally exposed. When Charles finally pulled back, he wiped his eyes with his sleeve. Can I ask you something else? Anything. Did you love him? Betty's chest tightened. Yes, very much. Do you still? She wanted to say no. Wanted to tell him that love died when Ralph walked away, that 15 years of silence had killed whatever feelings she'd once had. But lying to her son felt like a betrayal of everything they'd built together. I don't know, she said softly. I'm angry at him. And I'm scared of what him being in our lives might mean. But there's a part of me that remembers who he used to be, who we used to be together. Charles nodded like he understood, even though 12 was too young to understand the complicated mathematics of loving someone who'd broken you. He kissed her cheek and stood. I'm gonna go to bed. Love you, Mom. Love you too, baby. After he left, Betty sat alone in the dim light of her bedroom, staring at nothing. She'd told Charles the truth. Now she had to figure out what to do with it. If you've ever had to tell your child a truth you wished you could protect them from forever, if you know what it's like when innocence meets reality, and all you can do is hold them through it, then you understand why these stories matter. Comment below and tell me, have you ever had to choose between protecting someone and telling them the truth? Because I want to hear your story too. We're building something here, and your voice is part of it. Across town, Ralph sat at his desk, replaying every Tuesday afternoon he'd spent with Charles, the circuits they'd built together. The way Charles's face lit up when he finally understood a complex concept, the questions he'd asked about engineering and design, and how things worked. Ralph pulled up video footage from the mentorship sessions material he'd forgotten existed until tonight. He watched himself lean over Charles's shoulder, explaining soldering techniques. Watched Charles laugh at something he'd said. Watched himself ruffle the boy's hair in a gesture so unconscious, so natural, it made his chest ache. He'd been a father. For months, he'd been fathering his son without knowing it. His phone buzzed with messages from his assistant about tomorrow's meetings. He ignored them all. There was only one thing that mattered now. Ralph grabbed his keys, walked out of his penthouse, and drove toward Betty's neighborhood with his heart hammering against his ribs. He didn't have a plan. Didn't have prepared words or strategic approaches. He just knew he couldn't stay away. Not anymore. Not when he'd finally found what he'd been missing his entire life without realizing it. Ralph sat in his car outside Betty's apartment complex for 20 minutes, rehearsing words that kept dissolving before they reached his lips. I'm sorry felt too small. I want to know him felt too selfish. Please give me a chance felt like begging. Which, maybe it was, but begging required dignity, and Ralph wasn't sure he had any left. The building was modest, a 3-story walk-up with chipping paint and a parking lot that needed repaving. He'd passed buildings like this 1,000 times without really seeing them. Now he cataloged every detail. The playground with the broken swing, the community garden with hand-painted signs, the bicycles locked to the railing, one with training wheels that might belong to his son. His son, who lived here, who'd grown up in this place while Ralph had been accumulating penthouses and accolades and emptiness. He killed the engine before he could talk himself into leaving. The building directory listed Smith B. 2C in faded label maker print. Ralph climbed the stairs on legs that felt unsteady, each step echoing in the concrete stairwell. Someone was cooking curry. A television blared through a thin wall. Normal sounds, family sounds, sounds he'd traded for silence and square footage. He stood outside 2C for a full minute before knocking. Footsteps approached lighter than Betty's, quicker. The door swung open, and there was Charles, wearing a t-shirt with a periodic table on it, holding a glass of water. They stared at each other. Ralph watched understanding dawn in his son's eyes, the same eyes that looked back at him from mirrors, the same eyes that proved what Betty had said was true even before DNA tests or birth certificates could confirm it. "Mr. Walker?" Charles's voice was careful, surprised. "What are you?" "Charles." Ralph's throat tightened. I came to talk. If that's okay. If your mother..." "Who is it, baby?" Betty's voice called from somewhere inside. Charles didn't answer. He just kept staring at Ralph with an expression too complicated for a 12-year-old to wear hope and confusion and caution all tangled together. Then Betty appeared behind Charles, still in her server uniform, her hair pulled back in the same ponytail she'd worn 15 years ago. She froze when she saw Ralph, one hand gripping the doorframe like it was the only thing keeping her upright. "What are you doing here?" "I couldn't stay away." The words came out raw, unpolished. Ralph had negotiated billion-dollar deals with prepared statements and strategic pauses, but standing in this fluorescent-lit hallway, he had nothing but truth. "I know I don't have the right. I know you told me to go home, but I can't," his voice cracked. "I can't walk away from him again." Betty's jaw tightened. He watched her calculating anger versus mercy, protection versus possibility. Her hand moved to Charles's shoulder, an unconscious gesture of shielding. "You can't just show up and..." "I know," Ralph held up his hands. "Surrender and plea both. I know, but Charles deserves the choice. Not you, not me, him." The statement hung in the air. Betty looked down at their son, who was watching them both with those two observant eyes. "What do you want, Charles?" she asked softly. Ralph's heart hammered against his ribs. Everything, his future, his redemption, his chance at being more than the man who ran balanced on whatever his 12-year-old son said next. Charles looked at Ralph. "Did you mean it? In the parking lot yesterday, when you told my mom you wanted to show up?" "Yes." The word came out like an oath. Then, Charles glanced at his mother, seeking permission she hadn't granted. "Maybe you could come in? Just for a little while?" Betty's face flickered through a dozen emotions Ralph couldn't name, but she stepped back, opening the door wider. 30 minutes. That's it. Ralph crossed the threshold into the small apartment and felt like he was crossing into a different universe. The living room was cramped but carefully maintained worn furniture covered with throws that looked handmade, bookshelves crammed with paperbacks and textbooks, a kitchen table covered in Charles's homework. Photos covered one wall, Charles at different ages, Betty's smile constant in every frame. A life documented in drugstore prints and grocery store frames. A life he hadn't been part of. Charles gestured toward the couch. "You want to sit?" Ralph sat, feeling too large for the space, too formal in his designer jeans and cashmere sweater. He'd changed before driving over, ditching the suit for something more casual, but he still felt like an imposter in this world Betty had built without him. Betty retreated to the kitchen but didn't leave. She leaned against the counter with her arms crossed, watching them like a referee ready to call the match. Charles sat in the armchair across from him, perched on the edge like he might need to run. "Mom told me the truth last night, about you being my dad." The word dad hit Ralph in the chest. He'd heard it 1,000 times directed at other men, but never at him, never earned. "I'm sorry," Ralph said, and the inadequacy of those two words nearly choked him. "I'm sorry I wasn't there. I'm sorry you grew up not knowing me. I'm sorry your mother had to do everything alone, because I was too scared to stay." Charles nodded slowly, processing. "She said you didn't know about me until yesterday." "I didn't, but that's not an excuse." Ralph leaned forward, needing Charles to understand. "I left your mother when she told me she was pregnant. I was building my company and drowning in pressure and terrified I'd fail. And instead of fighting for us, I ran. That's on me. Not knowing you existed doesn't erase the fact that I abandoned her, abandoned both of you when you needed me most." From the kitchen, Ralph heard Betty's sharp intake of breath. He didn't look at her, kept his eyes on Charles. "I can't change the past," he continued. "I can't give you back the 12 years we lost. But if you'll let me, if your mother will let me, I want to try. I want to know you, not as your mentor, as your father." Charles was quiet for a long moment. Then he asked, "What's my middle name?" The question caught Ralph off guard. "What? My middle name? If you want to be my dad, you should know it, right?" Ralph's chest tightened. "I don't know. It's James, after my mom's dad who died before I was born." Charles's voice was matter of fact, but Ralph heard the test in it. My birthday is June 14th. My favorite food is tacos, but only with soft shells. I'm allergic to penicillin. I want to be a robotics engineer when I grow up. I hate math, but I'm good at it. I collect bottle caps. Those are things dads are supposed to know. Each fact landed like an indictment. Ralph nodded, throat too tight to speak. I don't know any of those things, he managed finally. But I want to learn them. All of them. Every single thing that makes you who you are. Charles studied him for another long moment. Then he stood, walked to his bedroom, and returned carrying a half-built robot. This is what I've been working on. You helped me design the circuit board during mentoring, but I can't get the motor alignment right. Ralph took the robot with shaking hands. It was intricate work, sophisticated for a 12-year-old, showing the kind of spatial reasoning and problem-solving that reminded him painfully of himself at that age. The servo mount needs adjusting, Ralph said, turning it over. See here? The angle is creating resistance. If we shift it 2 degrees and reinforce the bracket. He trailed off, looking up at Charles. Do you have tools? Charles grinned his first real smile since Ralph had arrived and disappeared into his room again. For the next 20 minutes, they worked together at the coffee table, heads bent over circuits and wires. Ralph explained voltage calculations while Charles asked sharp questions that proved he'd inherited more than just Ralph's eyes. They laughed when a wire popped loose, celebrated when the motor finally hummed to life. Betty watched from the kitchen, and when Ralph glanced up once, he saw tears streaming down her face. Not angry tears. Something more complicated, grief and wonder and fear all mixed together. When the 30 minutes ended, Charles walked Ralph to the door. Will you come back? Ralph looked past him to Betty, who hadn't moved from her spot by the counter. If your mother says it's okay. Betty's voice was barely a whisper. Saturday afternoon, 2 hours, we'll see how it goes. Ralph's knees nearly buckled with relief. Thank you. He turned to Charles. I'll see you Saturday. Okay. Charles hesitated, then added, Dad. The word was tentative, testing, but it rewired something fundamental in Ralph's chest. He had to blink back tears as he stepped into the hallway. Ralph drove home in a daze. The city lights blurred together. His hands trembled on the steering wheel. When he reached his penthouse, he poured himself a drink he didn't take a single sip of and stood at the window watching the sun rise over buildings he'd helped fund. His phone buzzed with messages, early morning meetings, investor calls, strategic decisions that needed his immediate attention. He scrolled through them with detachment, then opened his calendar and started canceling. Every Tuesday afternoon was now blocked. STEM mentorship with Charles. Saturday afternoon was now blocked. Time with son. He added evening blocks. Learn about Charles. Research parenting. Figure out how to be a father. His assistant called. Mr. Walker, you've canceled 3 critical meetings. Is everything all right? Cancel everything that's not essential, Ralph said. Indefinitely. Sir? I have a son, he said, the words still foreign in his mouth. And I've missed 12 years. I'm not missing any more. He ended the call and sat in the dark of his too-large apartment, staring at a photo of Charles he'd sent himself from the mentorship files. His son, his brilliant, kind, complicated son, who collected bottle caps and wanted to be a robotics engineer and had every right to hate him, but instead had called him Dad. Don't run. Ralph whispered to the empty room, to himself, to the terrified boy he'd been 15 years ago. Not this time. Not ever again. The Riverside Elementary Gymnasium had been transformed into a makeshift engineering lab. Folding tables lined the walls, each station equipped with toolkits, circuit boards, and the organized chaos of a dozen father-son pairs building robots. The air smelled like soldering irons and possibility. Betty stood against the back wall, arms crossed, watching Charles work beside Ralph at Station 7. They'd been at it for 40 minutes, now heads bent together over a tangle of wires, Charles's hands steady as Ralph guided him through connecting a motor to a battery pack. Every few seconds, Ralph would say something, and Charles would laugh, and the sound hit Betty in a place she'd thought she'd armored years ago. She'd almost said no when Charles brought home the permission slip. A Saturday morning father-son workshop felt like tempting fate, like giving Ralph too much too soon when she still wasn't sure he wouldn't disappear again. But Charles had looked at her with those eyes, his father's eyes, and asked, so carefully, so hopefully, that she couldn't find the word no anywhere in her vocabulary. So here she stood, watching her ex-boyfriend teach their son about voltage, while other fathers watched with polite confusion. Ralph Walker, Billionaire CEO, was the only parent in designer jeans, helping a 12-year-old solder wires in an elementary school gym. Mrs. Chen, from the PTA, approached with coffee in a foam cup and speculation in her eyes. "That's Ralph Walker, isn't it? The tech billionaire? I didn't know you two were together." "We're not," Betty said quickly. Too quickly. "Oh." Mrs. Chen's eyebrows climbed toward her hairline. "But Charles calls him, it's complicated." That was becoming her default answer. It's complicated covered 15 years of history, a son who'd never met his father, and the strange reality of watching a man try to earn back what he'd thrown away before he ever knew it existed. Across the room, Ralph held up a circuit board, and Charles high-fived him so hard the sound echoed. Betty felt her throat tighten. "They look good together," Mrs. Chen observed. "Natural." Betty didn't respond, couldn't respond, because it was true, and that terrified her more than anything. Charles had his father's intensity, his father's focus, his father's way of explaining complex ideas like they were the simplest things in the world. Watching them together felt like watching time collapse, seeing the boy Ralph must have been in the man Charles was becoming. The workshop coordinator called for a 15-minute break. Parents and sons scattered toward the snack table. Charles grabbed 2 juice boxes and headed for his friends, while Ralph turned, scanning the room, until his eyes found Betty. He walked toward her slowly, carefully, like she might bolt if he moved too fast. He was probably right. "Hey," he said softly, "can we talk? Just for a minute?" Betty glanced at Charles, who was demonstrating his robot to 2 other boys. 5 minutes. They stepped out into the hallway, where bulletin boards displayed student artwork and the fluorescent lights hummed overhead. Ralph leaned against the wall, and Betty noticed for the first time how exhausted he looked. Success couldn't hide the shadows under his eyes or the new lines around his mouth. "He's incredible," Ralph said. "The way his mind works, Betty, he's brilliant. The questions he asks, the way he problem solves." He trailed off, voice thick. "You did that. You raised him to be that." "I know what I did," Betty said, sharper than intended. "I was there for all of it." Ralph flinched, but didn't back down. "I'm not trying to take credit. I'm trying to say thank you for everything you gave him when I gave him nothing." Betty's arms tightened across her chest. "If this is another apology, it's an explanation." He ran a hand through his hair, that same nervous gesture from 15 years ago. "You asked me in the parking lot why I ran. I told you I was scared, but I didn't tell you why. Why I was so terrified of becoming a father that I walked away from the only woman I ever loved." The word loved hit her unexpectedly. She'd convinced herself what they'd had was young and foolish, and not built to last. Hearing him frame it differently made something crack in her carefully constructed narrative. "Ralph, my father left when I was 7, he said quietly. "Just walked out one day while I was at school. Came home and found my mom crying at the kitchen table with all his clothes gone from the closet. No note, no goodbye, just gone." Betty's breath caught. In all the time they'd been together, Ralph had never talked about his father. She'd asked once, early on, and he'd shut down so completely she'd never asked again. "I spent years wondering what I'd done wrong," Ralph continued, staring at the bulletin board like it held answers. "Convinced myself that if I'd been better, smarter, quieter, less trouble, maybe he would have stayed. My mom told me it wasn't my fault, that he couldn't handle the pressure of being a father, that he loved us but broke under the weight of responsibility. But all I heard was that I was too much, that wanting me had destroyed him." Betty's heart twisted. She'd spent 15 years angry at Ralph for leaving, but she'd never known he was running from this, from the terror that history would repeat itself. "When you told me you were pregnant," Ralph's voice cracked, "all I could see was my father's face. All I could hear was my mom crying. I was 25 years old, drow." Continuation of complete script. "Ning in business debt, sleeping in my office, and terrified that I was about to become exactly what I feared most. A father who couldn't provide. A man who'd break under pressure." He finally looked at her, and Betty saw tears tracking down his face. "I told myself I was being noble. That leaving was better than staying and failing you both. That once I built stability, once I proved I wasn't my father, then maybe I'd be worthy of being a dad. His laugh was bitter, broken. But I became him anyway. I repeated the exact cycle I was trying to break, and the worst part is, his voice dropped to a whisper. The worst part is, I never even tried. I just assumed I'd fail and ran before I could prove it. Betty stood frozen, watching this man she'd loved and hated, and tried desperately to confess the truth he'd been carrying for over 3 decades. She'd spent years imagining the reasons he'd left: cowardice, selfishness, ambition that mattered more than love. But this was different. This was a wound so old it had shaped every decision he'd made since childhood. "Why didn't you tell me?" she asked finally. "Back then, when it mattered?" "Because I was ashamed." Ralph wiped his face roughly. "Because admitting my father abandoned me felt like admitting I was someone who deserved abandoning. Because I thought if you knew the truth that I came from, that you'd see me differently. I would have helped you," Betty said. And her voice broke on the words. "Ralph, I loved you. If you'd told me you were scared, if you'd let me in instead of shutting me out. I know." The words came out like a prayer and a confession both. "I know. And I'll regret it for the rest of my life. But I'm telling you now, because you deserve the truth. Because Charles deserves a father who doesn't run from hard conversations. And because I need you to know that leaving you was never about you not being enough. It was always about me being terrified I wasn't." Silence settled between them, heavy with 15 years of misunderstanding. Betty thought of her son in the gym, building robots with the father who'd missed his first 12 years. Thought of Ralph showing up at her door, trembling with sincerity. Thought of the little boy who'd watched his father disappear and spent a lifetime trying not to become him. "I'm not forgiving you," she said finally. Ralph nodded, accepting this. "I understand. But I'm listening." The words surprised her as much as they seemed to surprise him. "For Charles's sake, I'm willing to listen. To try to understand. To see if you can actually be what you say you want to be." Ralph's expression cracked with something that looked like hope. "That's more than I deserve. It's more than you've earned," Betty corrected. "But Charles wants to know you. And maybe he deserves a father who's working on his own wounds, instead of running from them." From inside the gym, the coordinator called everyone back. Charles appeared in the doorway, searching for them with worried eyes. "Everything okay?" he asked. Betty looked at Ralph, really looked at him, and saw not the billionaire or the ex-boyfriend or even the father he was trying to become. She saw the scared 7-year-old who'd been left behind. The young man who'd convinced himself he was protecting her by walking away. The person he might have been if fear hadn't made the choice for him. "Yeah, baby," she said softly. "Everything's okay." Charles grinned and ducked back inside. Ralph and Betty followed, side by side, but not quite together. Two people learning to navigate a relationship that had ended before it ever really had a chance to begin. The robot lurched forward 3 feet, executed a perfect 90-degree turn, then stopped precisely at the finish line. The gymnasium erupted in applause. Charles threw his hands in the air, grinning so wide Betty thought her heart might burst through her ribs. "First place in the navigation category," the coordinator announced, handing Charles a blue ribbon. "Excellent work, Charles Smith." Betty watched Ralph stand from his spot at the judging table, watched him clap harder than anyone else, watched his face transform with pride so fierce it was almost painful to witness. When Charles ran toward them, he threw his arms around Ralph first, an instinctive gesture that made Ralph freeze for half a second before hugging back with trembling hands. Then Charles turned to Betty, and she pulled him close, kissing the top of his head, the way she had since he was small enough to carry. "I'm so proud of you, baby." "We did it, Mom," Charles pulled back, including Ralph with a gesture. The circuit design was perfect. The motor calibration was exactly right. It worked. "We." The word sat heavy in Betty's chest. 2 weeks ago, there was no we when it came to Charles's achievements. There was only her and her son against the world. Now, Ralph stood beside them, part of the equation, and she didn't know whether to feel grateful or terrified. The other families filtered out slowly, fathers helping sons pack up tools, while mothers collected permission slips and contact information. Betty lingered, watching Charles show his ribbon to Mrs. Mendoza, who'd stopped by to see her students compete. Ralph approached carefully. "He's amazing, Betty, the way he troubleshot that navigation problem. I know, she said quietly. I've watched him solve problems since he was 5 years old. Ralph nodded, accepting the reminder. They stood in awkward silence until Charles bounded back, practically vibrating with excitement. Mom, can I ask you something? Betty's stomach tightened. She knew that tone, the one that meant he'd been planning this question, rehearsing it, working up courage. Of course. Charles glanced at Ralph, then back at her. Can I spend next Saturday with Ralph? Like, the whole day? He said I could see his office and learn about his company, and maybe we could work on some more advanced projects. The request hung between them. Betty felt her chest constrict, fear and hope wrestling like they were fighting for her soul. This was what she'd been afraid of, that Ralph would become real to Charles, that their son would want more than supervised visits in school gymnasiums, that she'd have to let go of the control she'd maintained for 12 years. Charles, I don't know if… Please, Mom. Charles's voice cracked slightly. I want to know him. Not just as a mentor or someone who shows up to school events. I want to know what his life is like, where he works, what he does when he's not here with me. Betty looked at Ralph, who'd gone very still. His expression was careful, neutral, like he was terrified of tipping the scales in either direction. It would be completely on your terms, Ralph said quietly. Whatever boundaries you set, I'll follow them. If you want to come too… No, Betty shook her head. If we do this, it needs to be just the two of you. Charles needs space to figure out what this relationship is without me hovering. The words felt like jumping off a cliff. But, she continued, looking directly at Ralph now, strict rules. You pick him up at noon. You have him home by 6. You text me every 2 hours so I know he's safe. And Ralph, her voice hardened. If you disappoint him, if you cancel or show up late or make him feel like he's not your priority, this ends, permanently. Do you understand? Ralph's eyes shone with unshed tears. I understand. Betty turned to Charles. Okay, next Saturday. But if at any point you're uncomfortable or you want to come home… Charles threw his arms around her waist. Thank you, Mom. Thank you, thank you, thank you. She held him tight, breathing in the smell of his shampoo and sweat and childhood that was slipping away faster than she could catch it. Over his shoulder, she saw Ralph press a hand to his mouth, fighting to keep his composure. Don't make me regret this, she whispered to Ralph, to herself, to the universe that had dropped her ex-boyfriend back into their carefully constructed life. Ralph nodded once, a promise and a prayer both. Saturday arrived wrapped in November sunshine, and Betty's anxiety. She'd barely slept, running through worst-case scenarios like they were a playlist on repeat. What if Ralph got bored halfway through the day? What if Charles realized his father's world was too big, too polished, too different from everything they'd built together? What if this single day undid 12 years of teaching Charles that they were enough? When Ralph's Mercedes pulled up at exactly noon, Betty opened the door before he could knock. Charles was already waiting with his backpack, practically bouncing on his toes. Remember the rules, Betty said, gripping Charles's shoulders. Stay close to Ralph. Text me if you need anything. And, Mom, Charles smiled gently, I'll be fine. Ralph stood in the doorway looking nervous, in a way that seemed fundamentally wrong for someone who regularly pitched to venture capitalists. I'll take care of him, Betty, I promise. She nodded, not trusting her voice, and watched them walk to the car together. Charles chattered the whole way, gesturing animatedly, while Ralph listened with the focus of someone memorizing scripture. They pulled away with Charles waving through the window, and Betty stood on the front step feeling like she'd just sent a piece of her heart away in a luxury vehicle. She went inside and cleaned the entire apartment even though it was already clean. Walker Innovations occupied 3 floors of a downtown skyscraper with views that made Charles press his face against the glass like he was 7 instead of 12. Ralph watched his son take in the cityscape. The buildings stretched out like circuit boards, the streets below carrying people to destinations unknown. This is where you work every day? Charles asked, awe threading through his voice. Most days. Ralph gestured toward his office. Come on, I want to show you something. His office was minimalist glass desk, expensive chair, walls lined with awards and patents. But Ralph walked past all of it to a bookshelf, where an old photograph sat in a simple frame. This was me at your age, he said, handing it to Charles. The boy stared at the photo for a long moment, then looked up at Ralph with wide eyes. We look exactly the same. It was true. The resemblance was uncanny, same unruly hair. Same serious expression, same way of tilting the head slightly when concentrating. Charles held the photo beside his own face, and Ralph's breath caught at seeing his past and present merge. "My mom says I have your eyes," Charles said softly. "You have her smile," Ralph replied, "and her kindness, the best parts of both of us." They spent the afternoon in Ralph's private workshop, a room most people didn't know existed behind a bookshelf that swung open like something from a movie. It was filled with half-finished projects, prototype designs, and equipment that made Charles's eyes light up like Christmas morning. Ralph taught him about coding algorithms, showed him three-dimensional modeling software, let him design a simple app on a computer that probably cost more than Betty's car. They ordered pizza that got delivered to the 60th floor. They laughed when Ralph's demonstration robot crashed into a filing cabinet. And slowly, carefully, they built something neither of them had words for yet. "Can I ask you something?" Charles said during a break, spinning in Ralph's desk chair. "Anything. Do you have other kids? Like, ones you actually raised?" The question hit Ralph in the solar plexus. "No, you're my only son. So I'm not like a replacement for a real family you already have?" Ralph crossed to where Charles sat and knelt down so they were eye level. "Charles, you are my real family. I know I missed everything important. I know I can't change that, but you're not a replacement for anything. You're the person I should have been fighting for all along." Charles studied him with those two observant eyes. "Mom still doesn't trust you." "She shouldn't," Ralph said honestly. "Trust is earned. I'm trying to earn it." "Are you going to leave again?" The question was asked so carefully, so quietly, that Ralph understood this was what Charles had been working up to all day. This was the real test. "No," Ralph said firmly. "Never again. I promise you, Charles. I'm here for as long as you'll let me be." Charles nodded slowly. Then, tentatively, he asked, "Can I call you Dad? Or is that weird?" Ralph's vision blurred. "You can call me whatever feels right to you." "Ralph feels safer," Charles admitted. "Dad feels like something I have to earn permission for." "Then Ralph is perfect." Ralph's voice cracked. "And whenever you're ready, if you're ever ready for something else, I'll be here." Charles smiled, small but genuine. "Okay, Ralph." They worked until 5:30, when Ralph reluctantly announced it was time to head back. Charles talked the entire drive, asking questions about engineering and business, and what it was like to build something from nothing. Ralph answered honestly, including the failures and near bankruptcies and moments he'd wanted to quit. When they pulled up to Betty's apartment, Charles hesitated before getting out. "Ralph, thanks for today. It was really cool." "Thank you for giving me a chance," Ralph said. "Same time next week?" Charles grinned. "Yeah, definitely." Betty opened the door before they reached it, searching Charles's face for signs of damage. But her son was beaming, practically glowing, and when he hugged her and said, "Mom, you should see his workshop, it's incredible," Ralph watched some of the tension leave her shoulders. "Thank you," she mouthed over Charles's head. Ralph nodded and walked back to his car, his heart fuller than it had been in 15 years. If you've ever watched someone try to build a relationship they should have had from the beginning, if you know what it feels like to hope someone proves you wrong after they've proven you right for so long, then share this story. Share it with someone who needs to know that it's never too late to show up, that trying matters, that second chances aren't about perfection, they're about presence. The first time Ralph showed up to Charles's soccer game, Betty almost dropped her coffee. She'd been standing on the sidelines with the other parents, cheering as Charles took position as midfielder, when she spotted the Mercedes pulling into the gravel parking lot. Ralph emerged wearing jeans and a Walker Innovations hoodie, looking wildly out of place among the minivans and station wagons, but trying so hard to blend in that Betty felt something crack in her chest. He found her in the crowd, held up his phone showing their text thread. Charles mentioned a game at 4, "Okay if I come?" like he needed written permission to exist in their world. She nodded. He smiled, tentative and relieved, and took a spot at the opposite end of the bleachers. That had been 3 weeks ago. Now Ralph showed up to everything. Parent-teacher conferences where he sat beside Betty taking notes like he was in a board meeting. School fundraisers where he wrote checks that made the PTA president's eyes go wide. Pizza night at Antonio's, where Charles insisted Ralph join them, and Betty watched her ex-boyfriend struggle with a slice that dripped grease onto his expensive shirt while their son laughed. Ralph had rearranged his entire existence, canceled overseas trips, delegated responsibilities he'd never trusted anyone else to handle, blocked off Tuesday and Thursday afternoons for school pickups. Saturday was non-negotiable. That was Charles's day, and Betty had stopped feeling surprised when Ralph showed up at noon exactly, never a minute late, never with an excuse. He was learning Betty's world the way he'd once learned code, with focus and determination and a humility she hadn't expected. He knew which teachers were strict and which ones Charles could charm. He knew that Maurice's diner gave Betty the Thursday night shift and would drop off dinner at the apartment so Charles didn't have to eat alone. He knew their neighbor Mrs. Rodriguez babysat in emergencies, and that the landlord was useless about the leaky faucet. Betty had been trying to fix herself for months. The faucet got fixed. A plumber appeared one afternoon with a work order that listed Anonymous as the client. Betty knew it was Ralph. They didn't talk about it. They were building something tentative and fragile, co-parenting without the cohabitation. A relationship that existed entirely for Charles, but kept brushing against something else. Something that made Betty's heart stutter when Ralph laughed at Charles's jokes, or when their hands accidentally touched, reaching for the same permission slip, or when he looked at her across the soccer field with an expression that looked painfully like longing. She told herself it didn't mean anything. She told herself she was imagining it. She told herself a lot of lies that were getting harder to believe. The headline appeared on a Tuesday morning in the business section of the local paper. Betty's coworker Shanice thrust her phone across the diner counter during the breakfast rush, her eyes wide with gossip-induced glee. "Girl, is this your baby daddy?" Betty's stomach dropped. Tech billionaire Ralph Walker, spotted with mysterious local woman. The photo showed Ralph and Betty leaving Charles's school together. She was laughing at something he'd said, her head tilted back, completely unaware of the camera. Ralph was looking at her with an expression that made her breath catch, even now soft and unguarded, and unmistakably tender. The article speculated wildly. Was this Walker's new girlfriend? Was he settling down? Sources suggested Walker had been spending unusual amounts of time in suburban neighborhoods, leading a notably more private life in recent months. "That's not," Betty started, but her voice died when she read the comments section. "Bet she's after his money. Gold digger alert. Wonder if she knows about his other properties in Manhattan." She barely made it through her shift. By lunchtime, 3 more articles had appeared, gossip sites picking up the story, adding speculation and theories that ranged from ridiculous to invasive. By the time she picked up Charles from school, her phone had 17 missed calls from numbers she didn't recognize. Charles was quiet in the car. Too quiet. "Baby, what's wrong?" He stared out the window. Kids were talking at lunch. About the article. About you and Ralph being together. About me being his secret son that he abandoned. Betty's hands tightened on the steering wheel. "What did they say?" "Dylan Torres called me a bastard." Charles's voice was small. "He said my dad didn't want me, and that's why he kept me secret. Mrs. Mendoza sent him to the principal's office, but everyone heard. Everyone knows now." Betty pulled over into a pharmacy parking lot because her hands were shaking too badly to drive. She unbuckled and twisted to face Charles, who had tears streaming down his face. "Listen to me," she said fiercely. "Those kids don't know anything about our family. They don't know how hard we fought. They don't know that your father left before he knew you existed, or that he's been trying every single day to make it right." "But they're not wrong," Charles whispered. "He didn't want me back then. What if he doesn't really want me now? What if this is all just because he feels guilty?" Betty's heart shattered. Before she could respond, her phone rang. Ralph's name flashed on the screen. She answered. "Betty, I just saw the articles. I'm so sorry. I didn't know there were photographers." "You need to come over," Betty said, her voice ice. "Now." Ralph arrived 20 minutes later, still wearing a suit from whatever meeting he'd abandoned. Betty met him at the door with fury radiating from every pore. "My son was called a bastard at school today," she said before he could speak. "Because of those articles. Because people are speculating about us, about him, about why you're suddenly in our lives." Ralph's face went pale. "Where is he?" "His room." "And Ralph?" She grabbed his arm when he tried to move past her. "Fix this. I don't care how, but you promised to protect him. and right now, the whole city is treating us like a spectacle." Ralph nodded once and walked toward Charles's room. Betty stood in the hallway, listening. "Hey buddy," Ralph's voice was soft through the door. "Your mom said you had a rough day." Silence. Then, "I don't want to talk about it." "That's okay. Can I just sit with you for a minute?" Betty heard movement, probably Ralph, settling on the floor beside Charles's bed, the position Charles always chose when the world felt too big. They sat in silence for a long moment. Then Charles spoke, his voice muffled. "Do you really want to know me, or are you just here because you have to be?" "I'm here because there's nowhere else I'd rather be," Ralph said. "I know that's hard to believe. I know I gave you every reason to doubt me. But Charles, you're not an obligation. You're not guilt. You're my son, and knowing you is the greatest gift of my life. Even though you missed everything important, especially because I missed everything important," Ralph's voice cracked. "Every day I show up is a day I'm trying to earn back what I lost, not because I have to, because I want to, because you deserve a father who chooses you." Betty heard Charles crying soft, broken sounds that made her own eyes burn. "The kids at school said you kept me secret because you were ashamed. I kept you secret because I didn't know you existed," Ralph said firmly. "But now that I do, Charles, I want to shout it from every rooftop. You're the best thing I never knew I had. And if kids are being cruel, that's my fault for not being more careful. But I promise you I will never be ashamed of you. Ever." Quiet settled. Then Charles asked, "Can you stay for a while?" "As long as you need." Betty sagged against the wall, listening to them talk about nothing and everything, school projects and favorite foods, and whether robots would ever actually take over the world. Ralph's voice stayed steady, patient, present in a way that felt completely genuine. An hour passed, then two. When Betty finally knocked softly and opened the door, she found them on Charles's bed building a model airplane together. Charles's eyes were still red, but he was smiling, explaining wing dynamics, while Ralph listened with the rapt attention he probably gave million-dollar deals. "I called my PR team," Ralph said when he noticed Betty. "By morning, they'll release a statement clarifying that I'm spending time with family. No names, no details, but enough to shut down the speculation, and I'm calling the school principal tomorrow to address the bullying." Betty nodded. "Thank you. Can Ralph stay for dinner?" Charles asked. "Please?" Betty looked at Ralph, really looked at him, and saw something she'd been trying not to see for weeks now. This wasn't the terrified boy who'd run 15 years ago. This was a man who'd driven across town to sit on a 12-year-old's bedroom floor, who'd canceled meetings and restructured his empire and learned to fix leaky faucets, who showed up and kept showing up even when it was hard, who was becoming the father she'd once begged him to be. "Yeah," she said softly. "He can stay." Ralph's smile was worth everything. Leave a comment below if you've ever had to watch someone you love navigate cruelty they didn't deserve. If you've ever had to choose between protecting someone's privacy and defending their story. Because your experience matters, your voice matters. And somewhere in this community, someone needs to hear that they're not alone in this. The Riverside Elementary cafeteria had been transformed into something resembling a science museum. Student projects lined every available surface, volcanoes made from papier-mâché, solar system models hanging from ceiling tiles, poster boards explaining everything from photosynthesis to the water cycle. But the real showcase was the robotics section, where a dozen students had spent months designing autonomous machines that could navigate obstacle courses, sort objects, or perform programmed tasks. Charles's robot sat at Station 4, sleek and compact, with a design that reflected hours of work in Ralph's workshop and years of Betty nurturing her son's natural curiosity. It could navigate a maze using infrared sensors, sort colored blocks, and return to its starting position with precision that had impressed even Ralph. Betty arrived early, claiming a spot near the front where she could see everything. She'd taken the afternoon off from the diner, something she rarely did, because this mattered. Charles had worked himself to exhaustion on this project, filling their apartment with wire clippings and circuit diagrams, explaining voltage calculations over dinner, until Betty's head spun. She was arranging the small bouquet of flowers she'd brought when she felt someone approach from behind. Ralph stood there holding a massive bouquet of roses that probably cost more than Betty's weekly grocery budget. looking uncertain in a way that billion-dollar fortunes couldn't hide. "Too much?" he asked, gesturing at the flowers. "Completely over the top," Betty said, but she was smiling. "He's 12, Ralph, not graduating from MIT. Yet," Ralph amended, moving to stand beside her. Is it okay if I stand here, with you?" The question was careful, respectful of the boundaries they'd been navigating for weeks. Betty shifted slightly, making room. "Yeah, it's okay." They stood side by side as the cafeteria filled with families, parents holding cameras, siblings squirming in their seats, grandparents beaming with pride. Betty saw Mrs. Chen glance their way and whisper something to another parent. Saw the recognition flicker when people realized that yes, that was Ralph Walker, the billionaire, standing next to Betty Smith, the waitress from Maurice's diner. Let them stare, let them whisper. Her son deserved both his parents cheering for him, and she was done apologizing for the complicated path that had brought them here. The competition began with the younger grades. Betty watched Ralph lean forward during each presentation, studying the designs with the same intensity he probably brought to board meetings. When a third grader's robot malfunctioned, Ralph winced, like he felt the disappointment personally. "You really care about this stuff," Betty observed. "I care about kids being encouraged," Ralph said quietly. "I care about innovation being nurtured, instead of crushed. I care about—" He stopped. Then continued softer. "I care about the fact that Charles could have been standing up there years ago, and I would have missed it." Betty didn't know what to say to that, so she said nothing. The 6th grade category was called. Charles took his position at Station 4, setting up his robot with hands that trembled slightly despite weeks of practice. Betty's heart clenched. She knew that nervousness had seen it before spelling bees and science presentations, and every moment her son put himself on the line. Charles scanned the crowd anxiously, searching. When his eyes found them, both of them, standing together, his entire face transformed. He waved, small and quick, then mouthed, "Both of you came." Betty felt tears prick her eyes. Ralph's hand found hers briefly, a squeeze of shared emotion, before releasing just as quickly. "We wouldn't miss it," Betty whispered, even though Charles couldn't hear her. The demonstrations began. Charles's robot performed flawlessly, navigating the maze in record time, sorting colored blocks with mechanical precision, executing every programmed command like it was performing surgery. When it returned to its starting position and powered down exactly as designed, the cafeteria erupted in applause. Betty watched Charles's shoulders drop with relief, watched him look their way again for confirmation, approval, pride. She and Ralph both gave him thumbs up, grinning like idiots. 3 other students presented. The judges deliberated. Betty gripped the program in her hands so tightly the paper crumpled. "And the winner of the 6th grade advanced robotics category is Charles Smith," Betty screamed. She wasn't proud of it. She was a grown woman, a mother who'd maintained dignity through a decade and a half of challenges, but she screamed anyway. Beside her, Ralph was clapping so hard his hands had to hurt, his eyes shining with tears he didn't bother hiding. Charles accepted his trophy, a golden robot on a marble base, and searched the crowd again. Betty waved frantically. Ralph put 2 fingers in his mouth and whistled so loudly several parents turned to stare. Mrs. Mendoza approached with a camera. "Family photo?" The word family hung in the air. Betty glanced at Ralph, who looked like he was afraid to breathe. Afraid to assume anything. "Yeah," Betty said. "Family photo." They moved to where Charles stood holding his trophy, glowing with achievement. Mrs. Mendoza arranged them, Charles in the middle, Betty and Ralph on either side, all 3 of them beaming. The camera clicked, once, twice, 3 times. Betty looked at the image on Mrs. Mendoza's camera screen afterward and felt something shift inside her chest. They looked like a family. Not a broken one piecing itself back together, but a real family, whole and happy, and exactly where they were supposed to be. "Can I get a copy of that?" Ralph asked Mrs. Mendoza quietly. "Of course." As the cafeteria cleared and other families dispersed, Ralph leaned close to Betty, while Charles showed his trophy to friends across the room. "Thank you," he whispered, "for letting me be here, for giving me this. Ralph, I never stopped loving you." The words came out rushed, desperate, like he'd been holding them in for weeks, and they finally broke free. "I need you to know that. All these years building my company, All the success and the awards and the money, none of it filled the space you left. I just stopped believing I deserved you. Stopped believing I could be the man you needed." Betty's breath caught. The cafeteria noise faded to white noise, parents chatting, children laughing. The clatter of projects being packed up, all of it distant and unimportant, compared to the man beside her confessing a truth that rewrote 15 years of history. "I convinced myself you were better off without me," Ralph continued, his voice barely audible. "That Charles was better off without me. But standing here, watching him win, seeing the incredible person you raised him to be," his voice cracked. "Betty, I was wrong about everything except loving you. That's the one thing I got right, even if I was too broken to know what to do with it." She turned to look at him fully, saw tears tracking down his face, saw vulnerability and regret, and something that looked heartbreakingly like hope. "I'm not asking for anything," he said quickly. "I know I don't have the right. I just needed you to know. Needed you to understand that leaving you wasn't about you not being enough. It was always about me being terrified I wasn't." Betty opened her mouth, but no words came. Her heart was hammering. Old feelings she'd buried under years of necessity and survival were clawing their way to the surface. The memory of loving him, the ghost of who they'd been together, the possibility of who they might become. "Ice cream!" Charles appeared suddenly, breaking the moment. "We have to celebrate with ice cream. It's tradition." Betty blinked, pulling herself back to the present. "It is tradition. Can Ralph come?" Charles looked between them hopefully. Betty met Ralph's eyes, saw the question there, the careful hope he was trying to hide. "Yeah," she said softly. "Ralph can come." They ended up at Scoops and Dreams, a local ice cream shop that had been Charles's favorite since he was 6. Charles ordered his usual triple chocolate with gummy bears. Betty got vanilla with hot fudge. Ralph studied the menu like it was a corporate merger agreement before settling on coffee ice cream, plain. They sat at a corner table with the trophy between them, Charles recounting every moment of the competition, while Betty and Ralph listened like he was describing the moon landing. When Charles got distracted by a friend from school at another table, Betty and Ralph were left in companionable silence. "This is nice," Ralph said quietly, watching Charles laugh with his friend. "Yeah," Betty agreed. "It is." "Do you think," Ralph paused, choosing words carefully, "do you think there's a chance for us? Not now. I'm not asking for now. But someday?" Betty looked at him, really looked at him, at the man who'd shown up to every soccer game, who sat on bedroom floors helping 12-year-olds through anxiety, who'd rearranged his entire life to be present for a son he'd missed 12 years of knowing, who looked at her like she was still the girl he'd fallen in love with instead of the woman scarred by his leaving. "I don't know," she said honestly, "but I'm not saying no." Ralph's smile was small but genuine. "That's more than I deserve." "It's more than you've earned," Betty corrected, "but you're working on it." Charles returned, chocolate smeared on his chin, still chattering about robotics. Betty wiped his face with a napkin while Ralph laughed, and for just a moment sitting in this ice cream shop with their son between them, Betty let herself imagine what it might feel like to forgive. Not yet, not completely. But someday, maybe someday. If this story is making you feel something, hope, pain, recognition, possibility, then it's working. Because these stories exist to remind us that people are complicated, that families are messy, that love doesn't always look like the fairy tale, but it can still be real. Hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications, because there are more stories like this one. Stories about women who survived, who chose, who rebuilt, and you deserve to hear every single one. Betty stood at her kitchen window, washing dishes that were already clean, watching the November sunset paint her neighborhood in shades of amber and rose. 4 months had passed since that parent-teacher conference that had upended her carefully constructed life. 4 months of Ralph showing up literally and metaphorically in ways she'd stopped believing possible 15 years ago. She thought about the single mother she'd been on that October evening, rushing into room 12B, expecting nothing more than a routine conference. Thought about the woman who'd built walls so high she'd convinced herself they were protecting Charles, when really they were protecting her own broken heart. Thought about every double shift and lonely night and moment she told herself they were fine, they were enough, they didn't need anyone else. They had been enough, but maybe, just maybe, they could be something more. Through the window, she watched Charles in the small yard behind their building, kicking a soccer ball against the fence, with the determination of a kid who'd inherited stubbornness from both parents. Ralph had dropped him off an hour ago after their Saturday together, and Betty had seen something new in her son's eyes when he'd hugged his father goodbye. Not just acceptance, not just tentative hope, something that looked heartbreakingly like love. The knock came soft and uncertain. Betty dried her hands and opened the door to find Ralph standing there, without the armor of expensive suits or confident smiles. He looked nervous in a way that made him seem younger, more like the boy she'd fallen for before life had gotten complicated. "Hey," he said, "do you have a minute to talk?" "Really talk?" Betty's heart stuttered. "Charles is... I know. I saw him in the yard. This is about us." He paused, vulnerable. If there even is an us to talk about. She could have said no, could have protected herself behind the same walls that had kept her safe for 15 years. But those walls were crumbling, and maybe, just maybe, that wasn't such a terrible thing. "The porch," she said, "so I can still see him." They settled on the steps of her building, close enough that their shoulders almost touched, but with careful space between them. The evening air carried the smell of someone's dinner cooking, and distant traffic, and the particular scent of autumn giving way to winter. Ralph was quiet for a long moment, staring at his hands. When he finally spoke, his voice was low and honest. "I've been thinking about what you said that night in the parking lot, about how I forfeited my right to be Charles's father." Betty opened her mouth, but he continued. "You were right. I did. And I'm not here to argue that or make excuses. But Betty..." He turned to face her fully. "These past 4 months have been the most important of my life. Not because of my company, or my success, or any of the things I thought mattered. Because I got to watch my son win a robotics competition. Because I got to help him with homework. Because I got to be his father, even though I had no right to ask for that. Ralph, I'm not finished." His voice cracked slightly. "I need to know what you're thinking, what you're feeling. Because I love you, Betty. I told you that at the STEM fair, and I meant it. But I need to know if there's any possibility, any chance at all, that you might someday feel the same way again." Betty looked at him, really looked at him, and saw 15 years compressed into a single moment. The boy who'd left, and the man who'd returned. The fear that had driven him away and the courage that had brought him back. The mistakes that had broken them, and the choices that might heal them. "I was so angry at you," she said quietly. "For so long, I built my entire identity around being the woman you abandoned. The single mother who didn't need anyone. The survivor who'd made something from nothing." Ralph nodded, accepting this. "But watching you with Charles," her voice caught. "Watching you show up, and keep showing up, and learn how to be his father, even though you had no idea what you were doing. Ralph, you're not the same person who left me. Neither are you," he said softly. "No, I'm stronger now, more careful, more protective." She paused, more scared. "Of what?" "Of this," Betty gestured between them, "of letting you back in only to have you realize it's too hard, too complicated. That your real life is penthouses and board meetings, not soccer games and homework help, and a cramped apartment that smells like whatever the neighbors are cooking." Ralph's eyes shone with unshed tears. "Betty, this is my real life. Everything else, the company, the money, the success, that's just the backdrop. You and Charles are the story. You're what matters." She wanted to believe him. God, she wanted to believe him so badly it hurt. But 15 years of self-preservation couldn't be undone with pretty words. "I don't know if I can trust you," she admitted. "Not completely. Not yet." "I know," Ralph said. "And I'm not asking you to. I'm just asking." He took a shaky breath. "I'm asking if you'll let me keep trying. Keep showing up. Keep proving that I'm not going anywhere." Betty looked at Charles in the yard, then back at Ralph. Thought about the family they'd been denied, and the family they were slowly, carefully building. Thought about perfection versus possibility. Thought about the difference between protecting her heart and allowing it to heal. "I can't promise you romance," she said finally. "I can't promise that we'll ever be what we were when we were young and stupid and thought love was enough." Ralph's face fell slightly, but he nodded. "I understand. But," Betty continued, "I can promise to try. To let you keep showing up, to see where this goes if we take it slowly. One day at a time." The hope that flooded Ralph's expression was almost painful to witness. One day at a time, he repeated. That's Betty. That's more than I dared to hope for. It's not a yes, she clarified. It's not a guarantee. It's a choice, Ralph finished. And that's everything. They sat in silence for a moment, watching Charles kick the ball with increasing enthusiasm. Then Ralph spoke again, his voice rough with emotion. I won't disappoint you, either of you. I'll show up for every game, every conference, every moment that matters. I'll be the father Charles deserves and the man you deserve, however long it takes. Betty felt tears prick her eyes. You're going to mess up sometimes. Probably, Ralph agreed, but I won't run. Not again, never again. The porch door burst open and Charles tumbled out, sweaty and grinning. Mom? Did you see that goal? He stopped, looking between them. Are you guys okay? Betty wiped her eyes quickly. Yeah, baby, we're good. Charles studied them with those two observant eyes that saw everything. Then, without warning, he grabbed both their hands, Betty's right, Ralph's left, and tugged them to their feet. Come on, he said, pulling them toward the yard. You have to see this trick Ralph taught me. Betty let herself be pulled, one hand clasped in her son's grip, and the other, somehow, without quite knowing how it happened, now holding Ralph's. Their fingers had intertwined naturally, instinctively, like muscle memory from 15 years ago that had been waiting for permission to resurface. Ralph's hand tightened around hers. She didn't pull away. They stood together in the small yard while Charles demonstrated his soccer trick, something complicated involving a spin and a kick that he'd clearly been practicing. Betty and Ralph cheered like he'd scored the winning goal in the World Cup, and Charles beamed with the particular happiness of a child who has both parents watching him succeed. When the sun finally set and the November air turned cold, Charles ran ahead toward the building, already chattering about what he wanted for dinner. Betty and Ralph followed behind, walking side by side with careful space between them but with hands still joined. One day at a time, Betty said softly. One day at a time, Ralph agreed. They walked through the fading light, not quite a couple, not quite separate, but something new and tentative and impossibly hopeful. Behind them, the shadows of who they'd been. Ahead, Charles holding the door open, waiting for them both. Betty looked at Ralph and saw not the boy who'd left, or the billionaire who'd returned. She saw the man who sat on bedroom floors, who showed up to soccer games, who'd rearranged his entire life around being a father, who looked at her like she was still every dream he'd ever had. She saw a possibility. She saw choice. She saw second chances that came late, but came anyway. And for the first time in 15 years, Betty Smith allowed herself to hope that maybe, just maybe, they could build something beautiful from the broken pieces they'd left behind. Their little family climbed the steps together, imperfect, complicated, and real. Not the fairy tale they'd once imagined, but something better. Something earned. Something worth choosing. One day at a time. This is where I need to hear from you. In the comments, tell me, do you believe in second chances? Have you ever given one? Have you ever been given one? Because this community, this space we're building together, is about more than just stories. It's about recognition. It's about knowing you're not alone in the complicated, messy, beautiful work of being human. Subscribe if you haven't yet. Share this with someone who needs to hear it. And comment below, because your story matters just as much as Betty's, as much as Ralph's, as much as Charles's. We're all just trying to figure out how to show up, how to choose, how to heal. And we do that better together than we ever could alone.